No one at Whispering Hooves Ranch ever went out to the northern pasture at dusk. The land dipped and rolled there, cluttered with wild grass and the skeletons of old fences, as if the world was trying to forget something that had happened long ago. But Grace Holloway walked the boundary lines anyway, boots sinking in the soft earth, breath fogging in the cool evening air. Sometimes the quiet felt almost dangerous out here, memories pressing in like the weight of a coming storm. Grace was 45, her hair tied in a loose knot under a faded ball cap, the lines on her face marking not just age but grief. Once, she'd been a nurse in a busy Chicago hospital. Now, years after losing her husband and everything that felt familiar, she spent her days at Whispering Hooves, a haven for wounded kids, battered veterans, and animals the world called lost causes. People said she was healing, but most days, Grace felt more like she was just surviving. She almost missed him at first. Just a flash of gray in the farthest corner, near a broken gate swallowed by brambles. Grace paused, squinting into the deepening shadows. A horse stood there, if you could call it standing. He was old, a Mustang with a coat the color of storm clouds and scars etched across his flanks. He swayed on his feet, legs trembling, head lowered as if every breath hurt. His mane hung in matted tangles. Someone had once tried to brush him, then given up. Grace crept closer, heart pounding, hands out so he could see she meant no harm. The horse watched her, eyes dark and wild, nostrils flaring. There was something desperate in that gaze, something that made Grace stop in her tracks. She noticed the bridle, cracked with age and stained with sweat and blood, but still elegant in its own way. An inscription caught the fading light. "If you're reading this, I was loved once." Grace knelt in the grass, tears burning her eyes. She whispered, "Hey, buddy, you're not alone anymore." He flinched, almost collapsing, but didn't bolt. Grace moved slowly, murmuring nonsense, an old nurse's trick, until her fingers brushed the bridle. She could feel every rib beneath his skin. He reeked of neglect, but underneath the filth and fear, Grace recognized a spark that reminded her of the kids who came to the ranch. All hurt and hope mixed together. She checked for injuries as best she could. Fresh cuts and old wounds, some still oozing, some half-healed. Grace's gut twisted. Somebody had given up on this horse, but not before trying to keep him alive. Maybe they'd run out of money, or hope, or mercy. She saw it all the time in people, too. That didn't make it right. Grace reached for her phone, fingers shaking. "I need help out in the north field," she said when the ranch manager picked up. "Bring a halter and some blankets, and call Doc Simmons. He's going to need attention tonight." 15 minutes later, headlights swept the field as two staff members, Harriet and Kyle, pulled up in the battered ranch truck. Both were young, both skeptical, both tired of rescues that ended in heartbreak. When they saw the horse, Kyle shook his head. "He's too far gone, Grace. Even the vet'll say so." Harriet folded her arms. "We barely have funds for the healthy horses. The board will never approve this." Grace ignored them, focused only on the Mustang. "We're not leaving him here," she said, voice steady. "Help me get him in the trailer." It wasn't easy. Dusty, as Grace would later call him, panicked as soon as they tried to move him. He thrashed, wild-eyed, nearly crashing into the fence. Kyle cursed, Harriet flinched, and the other horses in the paddock screamed and stomped. For a moment, chaos reigned, dust rising, gates rattling, everyone shouting at once. Grace dropped the rope, stepped back, and waited, hands loose at her sides. "I'm not going to force you," she whispered. "But I'm not leaving either." Her patience outlasted his terror. Slowly, inch by inch, Dusty staggered toward the open trailer. Grace kept talking, low and calm, until at last he stepped inside and sank to his knees, exhausted. The drive back to the ranch felt endless. Harriet was muttering about protocols and the risk to the other animals. Kyle called ahead to warn the night staff. "We're bringing in a lost cause. Again." Grace ignored them. She rode in the trailer with Dusty, pressing an old blanket against his wounds, murmuring stories about her late husband, about hope, about finding light in dark places. Dusty barely moved, but his ear flicked toward her voice. When they reached the ranch, the real trouble began. Dusty, terrified by the barn lights and the unfamiliar smells, bolted from the trailer. He slipped on the slick concrete, crashing into feed bins and knocking down a row of tools. The other horses panicked, slamming against their stalls. A young volunteer tried to grab Dusty's halter. He kicked out, wild and strong for a dying animal, catching the edge of a metal post and tearing his side open. "Enough!" Kyle shouted. "We're putting him down, tonight!" Harriet nodded. "He's dangerous. You brought a nightmare here, Grace. He's going to hurt someone." Grace squared her shoulders, fire burning in her chest. "No," she said. "I brought him home. He gets a chance, just like everyone else." For a moment, no one spoke. The barn was chaos, blood on the floor, panicked horses screaming, angry staff pointing fingers. Grace knelt beside Dusty, her body between him and the world, refusing to move. "If he dies," she whispered, "he dies knowing someone cared. But I'm not giving up on him. Not tonight. Not ever." Dusty's breath slowed. Around them, the storm of anger faded, replaced by a heavy, uncertain silence. Grace stayed with him, unmoving, as the night crept in, sure for the first time in years that she was exactly where she belonged. Night at Whispering Hooves Ranch was always filled with restless sounds. The soft nickers of horses, the distant hum of cicadas, the whisper of wind moving through the hayloft. But that first night after Dusty arrived, there was a tension in the barn air that Grace hadn't felt in years. She rolled out an old cot beside Dusty's stall, bundled herself in a patched quilt, and listened to his ragged breathing. Outside, staff whispered in worried tones, debating her sanity and the ranch's future. Grace didn't care. She was determined to stay with Dusty, to prove to herself and to everyone else that every broken soul deserved a chance. As midnight deepened, Dusty remained standing, trembling with exhaustion and pain. Whenever Grace drifted close to sleep, he startled, his ears flicking back, eyes wide with a trapped animal's fear. Grace reached out softly, not to touch him, but to let him know she was there. "It's all right, boy," she murmured. "No one's going to hurt you here." She read aloud from a battered paperback she kept in her bag. Nothing fancy, just old westerns her late husband had loved. Her voice wavered and cracked, but she kept reading, her words filling the empty space between them. By dawn, Dusty was still standing. Grace rose, stiff and sore, and began tending to his wounds. She worked slowly, showing her hands, speaking gently with each movement. The staff watched, arms folded, skepticism in their eyes. "He won't let you near him, Grace," Kyle said. "Not after what happened last night." Grace ignored the warnings. She dabbed a salve on Dusty's flank, feeling the tremor in his muscles but also noticing, just barely, that he didn't pull away as much this time. She let herself breathe, just for a moment. Day after day, the routine repeated. Grace spent every night beside Dusty's stall, reading to him, singing old lullabies when the barn was dark and quiet, tending his wounds with hands that remembered a lifetime of healing. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of night, she told him stories about her husband, about the children who came to the ranch, about the kind of courage it took to keep living when life was unfair. Dusty listened, his eyes dark and ancient, a silent audience for a woman who was learning, slowly, to open her heart again. Word spread through the ranch. Some staff mocked Grace's devotion, whispering that she was losing her mind, wasting time on a horse too broken to save. Others, especially the kids and veterans who knew what it felt like to be abandoned, started to root for her. They left notes and apples at Dusty's stall. One little girl, Sarah, who hadn't spoken since her father died, pressed a handmade bracelet through the bars of Dusty's stall. He sniffed it, then let it drop, but the gesture mattered. The real turning point came late one night, during a thunderstorm. Lightning cracked the sky, rain battered the tin roof, and the horses danced with nerves. Dusty panicked, pacing in tight circles, head tossing, wild-eyed with terror. Grace slid open his stall door, kneeling in the straw, her hands open and trembling. "I'm here," she whispered, rainwater dripping from her hair. "I won't leave you. Not ever." Dusty snorted, stamping the floor, his muscles coiled and tense. Grace kept talking, not moving closer but not moving away. The storm raged, thunder echoing off the hills. Finally, as if defeated, Dusty slumped in the straw, sides heaving, and let Grace inch closer, close enough to rest a gentle hand on his neck. She felt the heat and the pulse of life, fragile and wild. She wept, right there in the straw, tears mixing with the mud. When the staff arrived the next morning, they found Grace asleep in Dusty's stall, her head resting against his shoulder. Dusty stood over her, not moving, his eyes calm for the first time since arriving. "Well, I'll be damned," Kyle muttered. "She's tamed the devil." But Grace knew it wasn't about taming. It was about trust. One broken soul reaching out to another, asking for nothing except a chance to heal. From that morning on, things changed. Dusty let Grace touch him without flinching, let her clean his wounds and brush his tangled mane. He even started to eat the oats and carrots she brought, though he was still suspicious of anyone else who came too close. The breakthrough that no one expected came the following week. The ranch hosted a group of children, most of them withdrawn, silent, dealing with traumas that had left them unreachable. Sarah, the little girl with the bracelet, wandered into the barn, drawn by the quiet. She stood just outside Dusty's stall, hands clenched at her sides, eyes wary. Grace watched from her cot, heart pounding. Sarah stepped forward so slowly it was almost painful. She whispered something no one could hear and reached out with a shaking hand. To everyone's astonishment, Dusty lowered his head and nudged her palm, his breath warm and soft against her skin. A gasp rippled through the barn. One of the counselors started to cry. Sarah smiled, a tiny, fragile thing, but a smile all the same. For the first time in months, the ranch felt hopeful. That evening, the news spread like wildfire. The impossible Mustang had let a traumatized child touch him. Parents, staff, and even some of the most hardened veterans came to see for themselves. Doubt gave way to awe. Grace sat by Dusty's side, tears in her eyes. "You did it, old boy," she whispered. "You reminded us all what hope looks like." The ranch was changing, and Grace's stubborn faith, once a point of ridicule, became a source of inspiration. Dusty, battered and old, was no longer just another lost cause. He was proof that with patience, compassion, and a little stubbornness, even the most wounded hearts could find their way back to the light. And for the first time in years, Grace believed it might be true for her, too. By the end of the first month, life at Whispering Hooves Ranch slipped into a new kind of rhythm, one no one could have predicted. Grace's stubborn devotion to Dusty became less of a spectacle and more a quiet foundation for the barn's daily life. The staff no longer hovered in the shadows waiting for disaster. Instead, they started asking Grace how he was doing each morning, nodding in approval when Dusty met their eyes, calm and steady. Even Kyle, who once argued for sending Dusty away, sometimes lingered a little longer outside the stall, tossing the old Mustang a carrot and trying not to smile when Dusty nickered in return. Grace found comfort in this routine, something she hadn't felt since the day her old life fell apart. Each morning, she'd rise before the sun, her joints aching from too many nights on a folding cot, and greet Dusty with a soft hello. She'd check his wounds, which were finally starting to heal, and run a brush through his matted mane, untangling the knots with patience and gentle hands. Dusty, for his part, waited for her now, ears pricked toward her footsteps. He didn't bolt at every noise anymore. Instead, he seemed to breathe a little deeper, as if each new day brought a fresh piece of hope. But it wasn't just Grace who changed. The whole ranch began to settle, the tension from those first dramatic weeks dissolving into the gentle hum of life returning to normal. Veterans from the nearby rehab center, men and women carrying scars of their own, started coming by more often, drawn by stories of the miracle Mustang. They'd lean on the fence, talking quietly, their voices low and rough with memories of things they couldn't share with anyone else. Sometimes, one of them would step forward, hand outstretched, and Dusty would lower his head, allowing a touch, a stroke, a moment of silent understanding between two battered souls. Children, too, found themselves drawn to Dusty's stall. Sarah, now a daily visitor, had become his self-appointed friend, sitting beside him and telling him stories about her favorite cartoons, or quietly braiding bits of his mane with colored ribbons. Other kids, once afraid to speak, followed her example, gathering around Dusty in the afternoons and inventing games where he was the wise old hero who saved everyone. Laughter returned to the barn, echoing off the beams, bright and healing. Grace watched all of it unfold with a cautious joy. She kept a small journal in her coat pocket, jotting down every milestone. Dusty eating from a stranger's hand, a veteran's first smile in months. Sarah giggling as Dusty nuzzled her hair. Each entry was a victory, proof that healing was happening in places she hadn't even dared to hope. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled over the hills and the world outside turned gray and cold, Grace invited a small group of children and veterans into Dusty's stall for a grooming session. Dusty stood quietly as they brushed his sides, his eyes half closed, his breathing steady and calm. Grace watched the group, old and young, scarred and hopeful, moving in gentle harmony around the horse. She realized in that moment that Dusty had become a kind of silent therapist for them all. Afterward, Grace sat with Dusty as the rain drummed on the barn roof, and she let herself remember her husband's laughter, the warmth of her old life, and all the pain that had led her here. She wrote it down in her journal, not as a story of loss, but as a story of finding new beginnings in the most unexpected places. The staff at Whispering Hooves began to notice the change, too. Harriet, who once doubted Dusty's place at the ranch, now brought him extra blankets on chilly nights and occasionally read to him when Grace had to leave early. Kyle became Dusty's unofficial farrier, working with careful hands and muttering about stubborn old gray ghosts who refused to give up. The rest of the staff followed suit, each finding small ways to show Dusty he was part of their odd, wounded family. As Dusty's reputation grew, so did the ranch's. A local reporter came by one afternoon to do a feature for the evening news, drawn by tales of the gentle gray legend. Cameras flashed as Dusty stood patiently, letting Sarah rest her head against his shoulder, the image of resilience and trust. The story aired that night, and soon the phone started ringing. Donors, volunteers, families hoping to bring their own children to the ranch for a taste of the healing magic unfolding in that quiet corner of the world. For the first time in years, the ranch thrived. Donations rolled in, and more children and veterans joined their programs. Dusty, once left for dead in a forgotten field, became the face of second chances, a living, breathing symbol that no life was ever truly beyond hope. The horses at the ranch, sensing the shift in their humans, grew calmer, their own anxieties soothed by the new routines and the laughter that had returned to the barn. Grace walked the pastures at sunset, breathing in the cool air, listening to the easy sounds of horses and children. And she let herself believe she was healing too. Every day she saw pieces of herself reflected in Dusty, the scars, the wariness, the need to belong. And every day she found new strength in the love and trust they'd built together. She tucked her journal away each night, heart full, grateful for the quiet, steady miracles that came not with thunder, but with the gentle rhythm of healing routines. Autumn arrived at Whispering Hooves Ranch quietly. Cooler nights, leaves drifting down from the maples lining the drive, the air rich with the scent of hay and earth. Grace found herself spending more time with Dusty, not out of necessity anymore, but because she wanted to. The routines that had once been a lifeline now became moments of peace. Each day, as she brushed the gray from his coat and watched him settle calmly amid the bustle of children and veterans, she wondered who had first taught him to trust. One chilly morning, as Grace was refitting Dusty's bridle, her fingers brushed something odd beneath the leather. There, almost hidden where the metal met the strap, was a worn piece of canvas stitched into a loop. Her curiosity piqued. She gently pried it loose and turned it over in her palm. It was an old ID tag, nearly illegible, but with a name and address scrawled in faded ink. Daniel Cortez, 201 Buckhorn Road, Santa Fe, NM. Grace stared at the tag, heart thudding. Dusty's life, his pain, his gentleness, the bridle that read, "If you're reading this, I was loved once." It all began to make a kind of heartbreaking sense. Someone had loved him. Someone had lost him. That night, after the chores were done and the barn lights dimmed, Grace sat in the office and wrote a letter to the address on the tag. She explained how she'd found Dusty, what he'd been through, how he'd become part of their family. Her hands trembled as she wrote, unsure if her words would reach anyone at all. Days passed. Grace told no one about the letter. She didn't want to raise hope only to be disappointed. Life at the ranch carried on. Dusty wore his new blue and gold blanket proudly. Sarah started talking again, and the veterans began meeting in the barn for coffee and quiet company. Autumn deepened, painting the fields with gold. Then, just as the first frost touched the grass, a letter arrived. The return address read, Maria Cortez, Santa Fe. Grace's hands shook as she tore it open. Dear Ms. Holloway, I can't tell you what your letter means to me. Daniel was my son. He loved that horse more than anything in this world. They were inseparable. Daniel called him Dusty because of the way his coat looked at dusk, all gray and wild. I lost Daniel in an accident almost 8 years ago. Afterward, I couldn't bear to keep the horse. I thought Dusty would have a better life with friends of ours up north, but I never heard what happened to him after that. I've always worried, always wondered. Your letter brought me tears and relief. Please take care of him. Daniel would have wanted that more than anything. I am sending you something that belonged to my boy. Maybe Dusty will remember too. With love and gratitude, Maria Cortez. A week later, a small package arrived. A faded, hand-stitched scarf with a pattern of horses and stars. Grace pressed it to her face, smelling the distant scent of childhood and heartbreak. She brought it to the barn that evening, the package clutched tight against her chest. Dusty watched her approach, ears flicking. Grace knelt beside him, held the scarf out, and spoke softly. This was Daniel's old friend. Maria sent it for you. She slipped the scarf around Dusty's neck. For a moment he stiffened, eyes going wide, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the fabric. Then something remarkable happened. Dusty's whole body relaxed, and he pressed his muzzle gently into Grace's hands. The gesture was so deliberate, so full of memory and recognition, that Grace felt tears sting her eyes. From that night on, Dusty seemed different, stronger, lighter. He moved through the paddocks with a quiet pride, greeting each child with a nuzzle, lingering a little longer with the veterans, as if he could sense their wounds. The scarf stayed tied around his neck, a badge of honor and a bridge to a life he'd almost forgotten. Children gathered to hear Grace tell the story of Daniel and Dusty, how the horse had loved, lost, and found his way back to family again. The story became a favorite at campfires, whispered like a legend that could heal anyone who listened. The staff noticed the change, too. "It's like he's come back to himself," Harriet said one evening, watching Dusty play with Sarah in the pasture. Even Kyle, who rarely said much, nodded in agreement. Sometimes the right memory is all it takes. Grace wrote to Maria, sending photos of Dusty in his new home, surrounded by children and hope. Maria replied with letters full of stories, of Daniel's gentle hands, his dreams of becoming a vet, his belief that every horse could be saved. Each letter brought a new layer of understanding to Grace's heart, as if Maria was helping her heal too. One afternoon, as a warm wind swept across the fields, Maria herself arrived at the ranch. She was older than Grace expected, her hair streaked with gray, eyes bright with the same fierce love that Grace had come to know. The reunion was quiet, full of tears and laughter, as Maria stroked Dusty's nose and thanked Grace over and over. "He saved my boy," Maria whispered, "and now he's saving everyone else." That night, as dusk fell, Grace watched Maria walk beside Dusty through the fields, the scarf trailing like a flag of hope. The ranchers gathered at the fence, silent, moved by the living proof that love and memory could bridge even the longest distances. For the first time, Grace felt the circle of loss and belonging close, not with pain, but with peace. In the months that followed, the story of Dusty and Daniel became a cornerstone of the ranch's mission. The power of memory, of connection, of never giving up on those we love, echoed in every barn aisle and every child's laughter. Dusty, the battered Mustang no one wanted, wore his scarf like a crown, and all who saw him knew that no one is ever truly lost, as long as love remembers. Winter came early that year, the first cold snap sweeping over Whispering Hooves Ranch before anyone was ready. Grace could feel it in her bones as she hauled extra hay into the barn, her breath fogging in the gray light of dawn. The horses grew restless in the cold, their coats thickening, their movements sharper. The children bundled in layers, noses red, voices muffled under scarves. But beneath the surface, a different kind of tension began to stir, one that no one saw coming. It started quietly. Harriet noticed that one of the older ponies seemed lethargic, refusing to eat his oats. Then a young gelding developed a cough that wouldn't go away. By the end of the week, half the barn was on edge, and Doc Simmons arrived with his battered vet bag, worry creasing his weathered face. "It's a respiratory bug," he said, after examining 3 horses in a row. "Probably viral. Not uncommon in the winter, but it spreads fast. With so many animals and so many kids coming through, we need to act quick." He prescribed isolation for the sickest horses and strict hygiene protocols for everyone else. The ranch's tight-knit community, usually so open and comforting, turned cautious. Buckets of disinfectant lined every aisle. Volunteers washed their hands until the skin cracked. Children were asked to stay back from the barn, and the familiar laughter faded into uneasy silence. For Dusty, the change was jarring. He paced his stall, ears flicking at every strange noise, eyes searching for Grace and Sarah in the suddenly empty barn. Grace doubled her efforts, spending long hours with him, reading aloud through her mask, brushing him with slow, steady hands. She watched every breath, every cough, every flicker of discomfort. More than once, she woke up in the night, heart pounding, afraid of what she might find in the morning. The crisis reached a peak when a second outbreak struck, this time not just among the horses, but among the residents too. A veteran who'd been volunteering at the ranch was rushed to the hospital with a high fever. Soon after, a staff member fell ill, and the fear that had been simmering now threatened to boil over. The ranch board called an emergency meeting. Grace sat in the drafty office, her fists clenched in her lap, as board members dialed in from their homes. Faces appeared on a flickering laptop screen. Trustees, donors, lawyers. Tension crackled with every word. "We have to consider shutting down until we can get this under control," one board member said. "We can't risk the safety of the children or the community." "And what about the animals?" asked another. "We're overcrowded as it is. Some of these horses, especially the older ones, are just too vulnerable. Euthanasia may be the only responsible option." Grace's heart clenched. "No, please. Dusty isn't a risk to anyone. He's part of the reason so many of our kids are healing. He's not just another mouth to feed. He's a symbol of everything we stand for." But the debate raged on. The board pointed to numbers, liabilities, medical advice. "We have to think of the greater good," they insisted. That evening, Grace sat in Dusty's stall, her back pressed to the wall, her breath shaky. She stroked Dusty's neck, letting the old Mustang nuzzle her sleeve. "I'm not letting them do it," she whispered. "You're not a burden. You're hope, and hope doesn't get thrown away." Sarah, who had been listening from the doorway, slipped in and sat beside Grace. "He helped me, you know," she said softly. "When my dad died, I thought I'd never feel better. But Dusty, he just listened. No one else could do that." Grace smiled, blinking back tears. "He listens better than anyone I know." The next day, Grace called a staff meeting in the drafty main barn, everyone bundled in coats and scarves, anxiety written across their faces. She spoke from the heart, voice trembling at first, but growing stronger with each word. This ranch is about second chances. For kids, for veterans, for animals. If we start picking and choosing who deserves to stay, who deserves to live, then we're no better than the people who gave up on us. Dusty deserves to be here as much as any of us. Her words hung in the cold air. Some staff members nodded. Others looked away, torn between fear and compassion. The debate spilled into the corridors and continued for days. Parents, already on edge, began calling, some threatening to pull their children from programs. Rumors flew on social media. The future of the ranch wavered on a knife's edge. It was Dusty himself who changed the conversation. One afternoon, during a particularly stressful therapy session, a young boy named Tyler had a panic attack in the paddock. He dropped to the ground, sobbing and gasping, while the other children backed away in fear. Grace and the counselors rushed to help, but Tyler couldn't be reached. He was lost in a storm of memories and fear. Dusty, grazing nearby, lifted his head. He walked over, not with the nervous steps of a horse unused to chaos, but with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had been there before. He lowered his head beside Tyler and waited, breathing quietly, his soft muzzle brushing the boy's shoulder. Tyler's sobs slowed. He reached out, fingers trembling, and grabbed a handful of Dusty's mane. The storm passed, and for a moment, there was peace. Word spread quickly. Even some of the ranch's harshest critics admitted that Dusty had done something no therapist, no medication, no program had managed. He'd given a broken child a lifeline. Slowly, opinions began to shift. "Maybe there's something to what Grace keeps saying," Harriet admitted to the staff. "Maybe some things are worth fighting for, even when it's hard." But the danger hadn't passed. The ranch remained under threat. Disease, bureaucracy, fear. Grace knew that saving Dusty and saving the ranch would take more than hope. It would take courage, community, and the willingness to stand up for the ones everyone else had forgotten. As the first snow fell on Whispering Hooves, Grace made a vow beside Dusty's stall. No matter what came next, she wouldn't let him go. Not without a fight. Rumors and anxiety spread through Whispering Hooves Ranch faster than any illness. By the next week, the crisis wasn't just about infection. It had become a storm of blame, fear, and uncertainty. Parents phoned in daily, their voices tight with worry. Some veterans packed up early, worried about bringing something home to fragile family members. Even the children sensed the tension, whispering in corners, hugging their therapy horses a little tighter as staff scurried from one crisis to the next. For Grace, every day began with a knot in her stomach. She moved through her chores in a fog of dread, holding on to Dusty's quiet presence as if it was the only thing keeping her anchored. Every time she entered his stall, he greeted her with a low rumble, the scarf from Daniel still tied proudly around his neck. There were moments, just moments, when the world outside faded and it was just the two of them, bound together by stubbornness, love, and shared pain. But outside Dusty's stall, the world was spinning out of control. The ranch board, under mounting pressure from health officials and panicked families, called for an emergency assembly. Flyers went up on local bulletin boards, and the community Facebook page buzzed with speculation. The notice was blunt. Town hall meeting, ranch future in question. Grace hardly slept the night before the meeting. She watched snow fall outside her window, imagining all the things that could go wrong. She scribbled notes and tore them up, her mind racing with arguments, statistics, desperate appeals to the ranch's values. By morning, her hands shook as she poured coffee and tried to steady her nerves. Word of the meeting spread far beyond the ranch. Families from town, some who'd never set foot at Whispering Hooves, arrived bundled in coats and scarves, faces tight with concern. Several parents, angry and frightened, threatened lawsuits if the ranch put their children at risk. Local health officials brought pamphlets and stern warnings about containment and liability. Even a reporter from the county newspaper hovered by the fence, notebook ready. In the hours before the meeting, Grace paced the barn, Dusty trailing behind her like a shadow. Maria Cortez, Daniel's mother, arrived in the late afternoon, her face lined with travel and worry, but lit by fierce determination. She hugged Grace tightly. "You're not alone," Maria said. "He's not just your story. He's ours too." Veterans who'd found peace at the ranch stood outside the barn, trading war stories and reminders of how much the place had meant to them. A group of children, led by Sarah, marched up to the meeting holding handmade signs. "Second chances matter. Dusty saved me. Don't give up on us." When it was finally time, the community gathered in the big hayloft. Folding chairs filled the space, the air thick with nervous energy. The ranch manager called the meeting to order. The board recited a list of risks and read letters from concerned parents. The county health official warned that closure or drastic measures may be unavoidable. Grace's heart pounded. She was about to stand when Maria, voice trembling but clear, stepped forward. "My son Daniel loved Dusty more than anything in this world. When Daniel died, I lost both of them. For years, I wondered what had happened to that horse, prayed he'd find someone to love him the way Daniel did. This ranch, Grace, these children, these veterans, they gave Dusty a new life. He's not a burden, he's a blessing. If you take him away, you'll break something that can't be fixed." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some nodded, others looked away, but everyone was listening now. Grace stood next. She spoke from the heart, her voice unsteady at first, but gaining strength. "When I came to Whispering Hooves, I was broken. I'd lost my husband, my hope. But this ranch and Dusty helped me believe in second chances. Every day, I see children and veterans heal here in ways doctors and medicine couldn't manage. Dusty might be old, but he's saved more lives than anyone will ever know. If we give up on him now, what does that say to everyone else who's struggling? That their time is up too?" Someone from the back, a grizzled Marine named Tom, rose to speak. "I wouldn't be here without Dusty," he said, voice thick. "He taught me how to breathe again. You take him away, you're not just taking a horse. You're taking hope." Sarah, hands trembling but face set, came forward. "Dusty helped me talk again after my dad died. Please don't make him leave." The meeting swelled with emotion. Even the skeptics, those most fearful, those who demanded tough decisions, were quiet now, listening to story after story of Dusty's quiet miracles. Then, in the middle of it all, the ranch manager brought up one last, desperate solution. "Let's let Dusty show us who he really is. If he can help, right now, in front of everyone, maybe that will help us decide." Nervous glances darted around the room. The manager motioned for one of the more anxious children to join her on stage. The girl hesitated, fighting back tears, then took a shaky step forward. Grace's heart twisted as Dusty, ears pricked, watched from the edge of the crowd. The girl stood frozen, unable to speak. The audience held its breath. Grace whispered to Maria, "Let him try." Dusty was led forward, slow and calm. He nuzzled the girl's hand, lowering his head to her level. She wrapped her arms around his neck and, slowly, her breathing eased. The silence stretched. Then the girl whispered, "Thank you, Dusty." Applause burst from the crowd, tentative at first, then swelling. Something shifted in the room, doubt melting into awe, fear into hope. By the end of the night, the board relented. No one was leaving. Not yet. The ranch would stay open, with stricter safety measures, but Dusty would stay, protected not just by rules and regulations, but by the fierce, stubborn love of a community that had learned what second chances really meant. Grace walked Dusty back to his stall, the scarf around his neck fluttering like a victory banner. She stroked his face, whispering, "We did it. You did it." For the first time in weeks, the knot in her chest began to loosen. The battle was far from over, but for one night, hope had won. The winter dragged on, bitter and unpredictable. There were days when a soft snow dusted the pastures and all seemed peaceful, but others when the sky turned iron gray and the wind howled down from the mountains, rattling the barn doors and sending the horses into nervous, skittish dances. Despite everything, hope lingered at Whispering Hooves Ranch, as if Dusty's improbable victory at the town hall had given everyone a little more courage. But no one was ready for the storm that came in late January, a blizzard so fierce the weather radio blared warnings all morning. By noon, heavy clouds had swallowed the sun, and snow began to fall in dense, wind-whipped sheets. Grace hurried from stall to stall, double-checking latches and tossing extra hay, her heart pounding with a strange, electric tension. She had lived through blizzards before, but something about this one felt different, more dangerous, more final. As the first drifts built up along the fences, a shout echoed from outside. "Flooding in the south field!" Kyle came running, breath steaming in the frozen air. "Creeks overflowing, horses are spooked, fences down." Grace didn't hesitate. She tossed on her heaviest coat and sprinted outside, boots punching through knee-high snow. The south pasture sloped gently downward, and the creek, usually a peaceful ribbon of water, had swollen into a rushing torrent, icy water pouring over the banks and swallowing the lowest fences. Two ponies and a young gelding huddled against a broken fence post, eyes wild with panic. Beyond them, deeper in the field, a group of children and volunteers were struggling to make their way back toward the barn, snow swirling around them, the wind tearing at their scarves. Without thinking, Grace waded in, shouting orders. "Kyle, get the ponies! Harriet, get the kids inside! Now! Everybody move!" Her voice cut through the chaos. She was halfway to the horses when her boot caught on hidden wire. She stumbled, catching herself on frozen hands. The water was rising fast, numbing her fingers. The gelding whinnied and spun in circles, trapped between the rising creek and the ruined fence. A flash of gray caught Grace's eye. Dusty stood at the edge of the pasture, nostrils flaring, mane whipping in the wind. He watched the scene, head high. Then, as if making a decision, plunged into the snow, making a beeline for the terrified gelding. "Dusty, no!" Grace called, but he was already moving, strong and sure despite the cold. He reached the gelding, pressed his body against the panicked animal, and step by step began nudging him toward the higher ground. The ponies, emboldened by Dusty's calm, followed his lead. For a few tense minutes, it was nothing but wind, snow, and the labored breathing of frightened animals. By the time Grace got to her feet, the horses were already moving away from the water, following Dusty. The children, seeing the horses run, cheered and started climbing over the drifted fence. The group made it to safety just as Kyle and Harriet returned with rope and blankets, helping everyone into the barn. Inside, chaos reigned. The barn shook in the wind, snow finding its way through every crack and knot in the wood. Lights flickered. The horses, wet and shivering, stamped and tossed their heads. Children sobbed, staff argued. Grace, soaked and freezing, helped strip off wet coats, moving from one shivering child to the next, checking for signs of frostbite. Then she heard it. A crash, sharp and sudden, from the far side of the barn. The old door had blown open, the wind driving snow inside, and in the confusion, a group of horses spooked, bolting for the open air. Grace lunged for the door, slipped, and hit the ground hard. Pain flared in her leg, white-hot and immediate. She tried to stand, couldn't. Panic rose in her throat. Dusty appeared beside her, snorting, eyes wild with fear but refusing to leave. He nudged her, snuffling her face, then planted himself between Grace and the open barn door. In her daze, Grace heard shouts, Harriet calling for help, Kyle yelling instructions. The world spun, cold and chaotic. As the last horse was rounded up and the door slammed shut, Grace faded into darkness. Dusty's warm breath, the last thing she remembered. When Grace woke, it was morning. The barn was eerily quiet, the storm having blown itself out. Weak sunlight slipped through the cracks, glinting on drifts of snow piled against the walls. Grace lay on a makeshift cot, her legs splinted and bandaged, a blanket tucked under her chin. Dusty stood over her, head lowered, eyes soft. He hadn't moved all night. Harriet crouched beside her. "He wouldn't leave you," she whispered. "Not for a second. We tried to get him to his stall, but he just stood there, guarding you. Didn't even blink." Grace managed a shaky laugh, tears stinging her eyes. "Stubborn old man," she said, reaching up to stroke Dusty's nose. "You saved us all, didn't you?" The story of Dusty's courage spread quickly. The children, once terrified, crowded around to see the hero horse. Kyle told anyone who'd listen about the way Dusty had led the horses to safety, how he'd guarded Grace like a sentry through the night. The parents, most of them moved to tears, brought casseroles and blankets. The local news sent a camera crew. Suddenly, the whole town was talking about Dusty, the old Mustang who refused to give up, no matter how bad things got. Later that week, when Grace could hobble around with a crutch, she watched Dusty in the field, scarf fluttering, scars glinting in the sun. She realized how much he'd changed them all, not just with gentle nudges and therapy sessions, but with real courage, the kind that faces down the storm and refuses to back away. The barn was battered, the field scarred, but the community was stronger. For the first time, everyone understood that Dusty wasn't just a symbol of survival. He was a hero, someone who proved that love and loyalty could weather any storm. That night, as the ranch gathered for hot chocolate and stories by the fire, Grace raised her mug and smiled. "To Dusty," she said, voice breaking with gratitude. "The horse who saved us, again." And all around her, people nodded, their hearts forever changed by one old Mustang's extraordinary courage. The days after the storm felt different. There was a softness in the winter sunlight, a hush of hope settling over Whispering Hooves Ranch as the snow slowly melted and the world came back to life. The barn, battered by wind and ice, still stood strong, just like everyone inside it. People smiled more, even as they shoveled slush and hammered loose boards back into place. When Dusty moved through the yard, scarf fluttering, children would call his name, parents would stop to pat his neck, and even the gruffest staff paused to admire him. Word of Dusty's heroism traveled fast. The story of the miracle Mustang, who saved children and horses in a blizzard, made the rounds on local news, then leapt to state papers and animal advocacy blogs. Donations, large and small, arrived every day. Envelopes with crumpled bills from local classrooms, big checks from city philanthropists, boxes of horse blankets and books and cookies with thank you notes in childish handwriting. There was even a hand-painted sign from the town elementary school. "Thank you, Dusty." With the flood of support came security and possibility. The board, no longer talking about closures or tough choices, voted unanimously to invest in the ranch's future. They hired builders to repair the old barn and begin work on a brand new therapy center, one with heated stalls, accessible spaces for veterans with mobility issues, and a sunroom lined with windows for children who needed quiet places to read and dream. It was only natural that the new building would be named Dusty's Barn. Grace nearly cried when the architect presented a rendering with Dusty's face, scarf, and all painted on the entry sign. "He's more than a horse to us," Grace told the local news crew. "He's a reminder that even the most forgotten among us can do something extraordinary, if only we give them a chance." With new resources came new faces. Therapists from other towns wrote to ask about animal-assisted therapy. Parents drove from 3 counties away, bringing anxious children and wounded teenagers in search of the healing they'd read about online. Veterans, too, arrived by the dozens, some silent and guarded, others eager to meet the famous Mustang who'd weathered the storm. Dusty, for his part, handled it all with gentle dignity. He took to his role as the ranch's ambassador with calm patience, greeting visitors in the paddock and standing quietly while children hugged him or whispered their fears. When he grew tired, he retreated to his stall, scarf wrapped snug around his neck, and rested in the golden straw while Grace sat nearby, writing in her journal. Grace had always been a private person, but now her words felt important. She wrote about Dusty's journey, about the children and veterans he'd helped, about the day he led the herd to safety. At the urging of friends and colleagues, she submitted her journal to a national animal therapy organization. To her astonishment, they not only published it, they sent it to therapists, teachers, and parents all across the country, calling it Dusty's Light, Lessons in Healing from a Mustang's Heart. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from families and therapists everywhere. "My son is talking again," wrote one mother in Iowa. "After reading Dusty's story, my students are kinder to our school's therapy dog," a teacher shared. The story inspired animal rescue groups to launch new programs and prompted a wave of support for animal-assisted therapy. What had begun as one horse's journey through loss and pain was now helping people heal across the nation. Maria, too, found a new purpose. After the storm, she visited the ranch more often, sometimes for weeks at a time. She and Grace became close, bound by grief and gratitude, each finding comfort in the other's memories. One snowy afternoon, over coffee in the kitchen, Maria suggested starting a support group for grieving families. "There's so much pain out there," she said, her eyes shining with resolve. "But maybe if we help each other, we can turn that pain into something good." The group began simply. Just a few parents, Grace, Maria, and a veteran who'd lost his wife. They met in Dusty's barn, sometimes sitting in silence, sometimes sharing stories of love and loss. Soon, more joined. Children with shy voices, grandparents carrying old wounds, parents learning to hope again. What bound them was the belief that no one's pain should be carried alone, and that healing, while never easy, was always possible. As winter melted into spring, Whispering Hooves Ranch blossomed. Daffodils bloomed along the fences, calves frisked in the pastures, and the new barn filled with sunlight and laughter. Dusty grew slower, his face graying around the eyes, but his spirit was as strong as ever. He spent his days in the paddock, walking the fields with Grace, letting the children braid flowers into his mane. At night, Grace often found him standing at the pasture fence, gazing at the horizon, scarf rippling in the breeze, as if remembering Daniel and all the lives he'd touched. The ranch became a place of pilgrimage. Families traveled for miles just to pat Dusty's nose or sit by his side and listen to Grace tell his story. News crews filmed segments about the gentle legend of Whispering Hooves. Children who once came in silence now led tours, introducing new arrivals to their favorite horses, explaining how a Mustang taught them to trust again. For Grace, every day felt like a gift, a new beginning she had never dared hope for. Sometimes, when the work was done and the sun was setting behind the hills, she'd sit in the grass with Maria, Sarah, and the other children, watching Dusty graze. She would listen to the soft rhythm of hoofbeats, the laughter of friends, the quiet strength of a horse who refused to give up. And she knew, deep in her bones, that Dusty's story was far from over. His legacy, of second chances, of healing, of love that refuses to quit, was just beginning to change the world. The world had changed around Whispering Hooves Ranch, and so had the people who called it home. It was no longer just a sanctuary for the forgotten. It had become a beacon, a place where visitors arrived hungry for hope and left believing that second chances could be real, even for themselves. Grace had never imagined she would stand before hundreds of people, speaking about loss, trauma, and healing. Yet invitations poured in from animal therapy conferences, school districts, and veterans groups across the state. The story of Dusty, how an old, battered Mustang had transformed the lives of children and veterans, resonated with people everywhere. And the more Grace spoke, the more she realized the story wasn't just about Dusty. It was about the willingness to show up, day after day, for the people and animals the world too often overlooked. Grace's first big talk was at a national conference for trauma therapy in Denver. She stood backstage, her hands sweating, clutching a photo of Dusty with Sarah and Maria. For a moment, her nerves nearly got the best of her. Then she remembered Dusty's calm eyes, the way he'd stood by her side in the blizzard, the way he'd pressed his muzzle into her hand the night she wrapped Daniel's scarf around his neck. She took a breath and stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright, but she found her voice. "I came to Whispering Hooves Ranch as a survivor of loss. I thought I was here to help others heal, but the truth is, I was as broken as any of our horses or kids." It was Dusty, an animal most people had given up on, who reminded me that real healing takes time, patience, and presence. Sometimes it takes just one creature willing to stand by your side, no matter how bad things get. Grace spoke about silent empathy, how Dusty never rushed or judged, how he simply existed alongside others' pain, making it bearable. She shared stories of children who learned to smile again, veterans who found the courage to try, families who let go of guilt and found peace. Each story built upon the next, a testament to the quiet, persistent power of love. After her talk, people waited in line to thank her, some in tears, others asking for advice about their own wounded animals or struggling loved ones. Grace found herself writing emails late into the night, answering questions, sharing Dusty's story, encouraging strangers to trust in the slow, gentle work of healing. Back at the ranch, Dusty's legend continued to grow. The media attention brought a wave of volunteers and visitors, but the heart of the place remained unchanged. Children still arrived frightened and closed off. Veterans still came wary and silent. But now, every person who stepped onto the grounds found evidence that transformation was possible. The ranch hosted weekly open days, inviting local schools, therapy groups, and military families. On these days, the fields bustled with laughter and activity. Picnic blankets on the grass, games with therapy dogs, storytelling sessions in the hayloft. Dusty, though aging, remained the quiet center of it all. He let new children braid ribbons in his mane, rested his head on the knees of trembling veterans, and stood for hours by the fence as parents whispered their fears and dreams. Grace began to notice something else, too. The children and veterans who'd once needed so much now gave back in ways she'd never expected. Sarah, who'd found her voice with Dusty, helped new arrivals settle in, teaching them to brush and feed the horses. Tom, the grizzled Marine, organized a hero's garden behind the barn, planting flowers for every child and animal who'd healed there. Maria and Grace's support group flourished, with parents supporting each other through loss and uncertainty. Even staff who'd once doubted the ranch's mission changed. Harriet, who'd once argued for sending Dusty away, became one of his fiercest protectors. Kyle, who'd called him a lost cause, now led workshops on horse therapy for visiting counselors. Grace saw in every face the lesson Dusty had taught her, that the world changes not through grand gestures, but through steady, unwavering care. The national media picked up on the story. Reporters visited, filming segments for TV about the gentle gray legend of whispering hooves. Features ran in magazines about the healing power of animals and the resilience of rural communities. Grace found herself quoted in articles and interviewed on radio shows. Every time she was asked about the ranch's secret, she gave the same answer: patience, empathy, and never, ever giving up. But it wasn't just about Dusty anymore. His story became a model for programs everywhere. New animal-assisted therapy initiatives launched across the country, modeled after whispering hooves. Other barns rescued forgotten Mustangs, giving them work with children and veterans. Animal shelters set up silent comfort programs, letting the most traumatized rescues simply exist alongside humans who understood their pain. Dusty's story echoed in places Grace would never visit, changing lives she would never meet. One bright spring day, the ranch held a celebration for the opening of Dusty's barn. Families, veterans, and supporters filled the grounds. Maria brought a basket of Daniel's favorite blue ribbons. Sarah gave a speech about finding hope again. Grace spoke last, her words quiet but certain. "We've all lost something," she said, her eyes meeting the crowd. "Sometimes we feel forgotten, left behind. But Dusty taught us that no one is ever truly alone, not if we're willing to reach out, to wait, to care. The quietest bonds can change the world." That afternoon, a new plaque was hung in the barn. Healing takes time. Presence matters. The world is changed by those who refuse to give up. The children cheered, the veterans saluted, and Dusty, old, gray, and beloved, stood at the center, soaking in the sunshine and the love of a family he'd made his own. And the lesson Grace had learned above all else was this: healing is never easy, never simple, never fast. But if you keep showing up, if you choose to love quietly and fiercely, day after day, miracles are not only possible, they are inevitable. As the years quietly turned, Whispering Hooves Ranch grew not just in size but in spirit. The new barn, Dusty's barn, stood bright and bustling, a daily reminder of one gray Mustang's courage and one woman's unwavering faith. But time, as it always does, moved forward, and even legends must face the softness of an ending. Dusty grew slower with each passing season. His mane had faded to pure white, his eyes growing cloudier but still sharp with a kindness that seemed almost otherworldly. He spent more time resting in the field, letting the children come to him, content to stand in the sunlight as they braided his tail or whispered their hopes. Grace watched the changes with a bittersweet tenderness. She counted every day with him as a blessing, knowing the end was near, but never letting grief shadow their remaining time. The spring he turned 30, Dusty seemed to gather his strength for one last glorious run. The whole ranch watched as he galloped across the paddock, Scarf flying behind him, Sarah and Maria cheering from the fence. For a moment, he was young again, a wild Mustang, legs stretching, mane streaming, his very presence defying every odd. When he slowed, he trotted back to Grace and pressed his head into her chest, as if saying thank you, as if saying goodbye. That summer, Grace spent every possible moment by Dusty's side. She read to him in the quiet afternoons, old westerns and poems, her voice soft with love. She brushed him with gentle hands, sang to him as dusk fell, and sat beside him in the grass as the stars began to blink overhead. Maria, too, visited often, sharing stories of Daniel and childhood summers, weaving new memories into the fabric of Dusty's life. The children, veterans, and staff all knew what was coming, and the ranch seemed to hold its breath in anticipation, everyone quietly savoring each shared hour. On a golden evening at the end of August, Grace found Dusty lying beneath his favorite oak, the scarf still wrapped around his neck, the sun painting his coat with light. She sat down beside him, stroking his face, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Dusty raised his head one last time, pressed his muzzle against Grace's hand, and with a final deep breath, let go, peaceful, surrounded by those who loved him. The ranch mourned together. The children made paper flowers and placed them around the oak. The veterans dug a small memorial garden, planting wildflowers and painting stones with messages of hope. Maria, Sarah, and Grace gathered with the staff and volunteers and placed a simple, beautiful stone beneath the tree, inscribed, "He was loved, and he loved in return." Dusty's passing could have broken the ranch, but it didn't. Instead, it became the source of a new strength, a living proof that no life, animal or human, is ever truly lost when met with patience, love, and a second chance. The ranchers shared stories of the gentle gray legend with every new arrival. Dusty's photo, scarf bright, eyes wise, hung at the entry of the therapy barn, inspiring everyone who walked through its doors. Grace, forever changed, found herself stepping into a new role. She spoke at schools, conferences, and community gatherings, not just about Dusty, but about the deeper lessons he left behind. "It's easy to love what is strong, young, and full of promise," she told her listeners. "But the greatest transformations come when we love what is broken, forgotten, or worn by the world." Dusty taught us that even in silence, even in pain, there is a possibility for healing and light. The ranch's work flourished. Dusty's barn became a model for animal-assisted therapy, visited by counselors and veterans advocates from all over the country. Maria and Grace's support group expanded, helping families navigate their own storms of grief and loss. Sarah grew into a confident young woman, guiding new children through the barn and sharing her story with a quiet pride. The veterans, too, found purpose in Dusty's memory, running workshops for those struggling to find hope in dark times. Each year, on the anniversary of Dusty's passing, the ranch held a celebration, not of loss, but of legacy. Families gathered, music played, and children wrote wishes on paper and tied them to the oak's branches. Grace would read from her journal, reminding everyone that miracles are found in the quietest bonds, in the gentlest acts of kindness. The ranch garden bloomed brighter each year, a patchwork of wildflowers and stones painted with the names of every horse, child, and veteran who had found healing there. The memorial stone under the oak weathered softly, the words a quiet promise to all who read them. He was loved, and he loved in return. In the end, Dusty's greatest gift was not survival, but connection. He had brought together a community that learned to see beyond scars and sorrow, a family built on trust, acceptance, and the refusal to give up. He changed the world, first for Grace, then for all the others who followed, one gentle day at a time. And Grace, older and wiser, found herself at peace. She knew that every life touched by Dusty would carry a part of his spirit forward. The ranch was safe in her hands, the work continuing with new horses, new stories, and new chances. As the sun set each evening, Grace would walk the pastures, pausing by the old oak, feeling the breeze tug at her hair, listening for hoofbeats in the quiet. The world kept moving, and Whispering Hooves Ranch kept shining, proof that no life is ever wasted, no love is ever lost, and the smallest acts of patience and care can ripple outward to heal wounds no one thought could mend. The gentle legend of Dusty endured, not just as a memory, but as a living hope, a promise to everyone who crossed the ranch's gates. No one is forgotten. Second chances are real, and the quietest bonds can change the world.